It is now my pleasure to introduce back to the stage our Privacy Commissioner. John Edwards has been the Commissioner since 2014. He has degrees in law and public policy and chaired the New Zealand Law Society Privacy and Human Rights Committee. He held warrants as a District Inspector for Mental Health and for Intellectual Disability Services and has provided legal services to the Kingdom of Tonga. He is on Twitter, but he has deleted Facebook. To set the scene for today's discussion, please welcome John Edwards.
Thanks so much, Michelle. What a great opening to our conference. I was with a friend at Easter, an old friend, who said, "Do you remember going to repertory classes in New Plymouth with Andrew Little and Stephen Joyce?" Listener, I did not. We are streaming this session, ironically, by Facebook. So feel free to tweet it out or Snapchat it to your networks. Let's get a signal boost. Let's get privacy trending in New Zealand. I wanted to start with a bit of a tangent. One of my favourite apps is Shazam. I don't know if you've got it. It's one of the most popular apps in the world, so I'm not alone. It's made the top 10 list as far back as 2013. And even now, it ranks 12 in the top free apps of all time for iOS for iPhone. It identifies music for you. If you're in a cafe or a taxi listening to a radio or a Spotify playlist, Shazam can tell you what is being played. I love that it works. I love being able to do that. It really fills a gap. But what I love most about Shazam and apps like it is what it says about human creativity and its infinite variety and uniqueness. The fact that within a few notes or bars, your combination of pitch, tone, tempo, and instrumentation is so unique to allow the very powerful back engine to identify it within seconds as distinct from millions of compositional efforts using the same scales, instruments, and pop music marketing consultants. That fact just blows my mind. Can we test it? Do you mind? Has anybody got a what's that tune on their Siri or a Shazam? Do you want to bring it out and enable it? The first person to recognise it, if you can pick this song, raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. You can tell us what it is. All right, I'll just give you a few moments. Anyone got their phone out? Does nobody else have this app? Am I the only one? Oh, we do. We're ready to go. Okay. Okay. We have some winners. Let's get a microphone there. What are we listening to? Let's see. It is Upon This Tidal Wave of Young Blood by Clap Your Hands and Say Yeah. Miracle. Was that Shazam or another one? It was Shazam. Shazam was bought by Apple Music last year, so I guess Shazam won the war for that space. But it was a hotly contested space for a while. I remember when I first started digitizing my CD collection in the mid-2000s, iTunes had a feature called Get Track Listing. Do you remember that? You'd rip your CD into your machine and hit that Get Track Listing button, and enough of the digital DNA of the tracks would be transmitted over the old dial-up line to Cupertino or wherever, and by some miracle, back would come the name of the album and often the CD cover image. Well, most of the time. When I hit Get Track Listing for the Clap Your Hands and Say Yeah album, something went wrong. I didn't notice for a while, but it did seem weird to me that this album would share so many names in common with the raconteurs Broken Boy Soldiers. The song you identified as Upon This Tidal Wave of Young Blood has inexplicably been known in my system across multiple devices and many iterations of iTunes and iOS as A. Ever since I ripped it. Now, so far, so what? My car has some kind of autoplay function. but I haven't figured out how to turn off or alter. So every time I plug my phone in, it plays the first alphabetically listed track in my iTunes, which is A. My family don't like that track. I can't think why, but I'll give you 30 seconds or so. You get the point, right? I think you know where I'm going. I hope so. A case of mistaken musical identity because of an algorithmic glitch that has proven very difficult to budge and causes ongoing irritation. Okay, so this is a privacy conference. What the hell are you doing talking about CDs, track listings, and your autoplay that you're too dumb to turn off? I have, ladies and gentlemen, used the device of metaphor. We've been thinking a lot about the risks that might be involved in extracting public or private value from data. The use of algorithms to run over your personal information in a data set to aid in decision-making that might affect resource allocation or the availability of goods and services to particular individuals in the economy by commercial or government agencies. Increasingly, managers, CEOs, ministers are asking, can we automate this? What can we learn from this data set that will inform policy or business strategy? The pressure to look to technology to provide answer to complex social problems is increasing and is supported by consultancies, data scientists, and software vendors who only have our best interests at heart. The White House put out a paper. This is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Ronald Coase. The White House put out a paper on this subject in May 2016, the other White House, a follow-on from their 2014 smash hit, Big Data, Seizing Opportunities, Preserving Values. That work was elaborated on and popularised in Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy, and is repeated in a variety of variations in a raft of other books and articles. The 2016 White House paper identified two main challenges. The first, inputs to an algorithm. What are the risks? Poorly selected data, incomplete, incorrect, or outdated data, selection bias, unintentional perpetuation and promotion of historical biases. The second challenge is about the design of algorithmic systems and machine learning. And there they gave us examples: poorly designed matching systems, personalization and recommendation services that narrow instead of expand user options, decision-making systems that assume correlation necessarily implies causation, and data sets that lack information or disproportionately represent certain populations. Let's just drop back in on our metaphor. I must have ripped about 200 CDs into my iTunes. There were a couple that didn't know. There was an album of live sessions from Bar Bodega called Solid Pyrite that mystified it. But only the Clap Your Hands and Say Yeah album, the machine got completely wrong. So what that means is the error rate is only 0.5%, right? Now, if I went to your boss and said, we can automate our decision-making with 99.5% accuracy, you'd win Employee of the Month and be offered a job with Google or Amazon, yeah? Except that success rate is not evenly distributed across all music. Early Shazam found classical music more difficult. Its success rate was a fraction of the rate it got with so-called popular music. I'm sure it would still struggle with locally produced indie labels or bootlegs of live shows. Similarly, we've all seen the examples of Silicon Valley's data input problem. African Americans tagged as gorillas in image recognition software, for example. A study on bias in facial recognition software by Joy Buloamwini a researcher at the MIT Media Lab, published in the New York Times in February, showed that gender was misidentified in less than 1% of lighter-skinned males. Less than 1%. That sounds like a winning algorithm, right? You run to the boss. Boss, we got 99% algorithm, 99% accuracy. But gender was misidentified in up to 7% of lighter-skinned females, up to 12% of darker-skinned males, and up to 35% in darker-skinned females. So the efficacy of that algorithm, trained as it was on the people who build the systems in Palo Alto and Menlo Park, becomes less useful when you try and roll it out to the wider population. She concluded overall, male subjects were more accurately classified than female subjects, and lighter subjects were more accurately classified than darker individuals. If your accuracy is based on measurements of only one input group, you might have to restate your confidence levels to your boss or funder. But let's assume you're going to reach Get Track Listings 99.5% accuracy rate. If you've only got pop music in your system, it doesn't matter that the algorithm can't distinguish between one jazz track and another. I might be straining the metaphor here, but for example, if you're wanting to use an algorithm to identify from your dataset the most needy in the community, for example, those you haven't been able to reach yet with your social program, building a model around data about people you do happen to have on hand, that is, people you have had contact with, might not help that objective. This was one of the problems we foresaw when we reported our reservations about the now canned plan to tie MSD funding to data in the NGO sector. Thank you. If you drive away the most vulnerable, their data won't be in your system. They won't be reported on, and therefore they're less likely to be targeted for assistance. On the other hand, no data, no problem. And while 99.5% accuracy might be a marketer's idea of paradise, when you're working with big numbers, assumptions based on close to 100%, so it's okay to intervene in individuals' lives or determine their eligibility for benefits or programs, that can have significant effects on the 0.5%. 120,000 people were registered as unemployed in January this year. 0.5% of that is 600 people. So if you're running some kind of eligibility or targeted intervention, 600 people are going to be misidentified as ineligible, which might be a lot of disruption and grief for an already vulnerable group, depending on what you're going to do with that data. A Wired magazine article in 2014 entitled "Algorithms Are Great, but They Can Also Ruin Lives" pointed out that in the US, an algorithm may falsely profile an airline traveller as a terrorist 1,500 times each week. Imagine being that guy. We've started doing some work in this area, focusing on predictive risk modelling to start us off. The first thing we found was that New Zealand government analysts seem to be the only people in the world who call this sub-genre of big data by that term, predictive risk modelling. What we mean by that term is the attempt to determine future outcomes or likelihood of risk by analysing the characteristics associated with those outcomes in historical cases. The more accurate predictive risk modelling techniques are the more use they have as a way to increase the timeliness of preventative responses, such as in the cases of protecting vulnerable children from harm. And you don't have to be as accurate as my old track listing app or Shazam to get the go-ahead. We've got national breast screening program, for example, based on 85% predictive success rate. If you'd told me when I started ripping my CD collection that it was only 99.5% accurate, I wouldn't have said, oh well, I'll just manually type in the track names then. I would have been happy to accept that my family might start to abuse me every time I went to charge my phone. Your tolerance for the inaccuracy should depend on the consequences and what steps you can take to mitigate the adverse ones. Likewise, the possibility, actually the inevitability, that your algorithmic aids have limitations might be based on flawed input, excluded data or sloppy matches doesn't mean you should ditch them. But we need to design in steps to ensure that the effect is continually monitored and to check that it is not embedding and amplifying the flaws of your earlier manual system. One of the problems we see emerging is the lack of transparency as to how these increasingly proprietary tools operate. in the US, the tension between the individual's right to know what factors are influencing an outcome that might send them to jail comes up against the commercial imperative to protect proprietary code, the intellectual property in the algorithm. One such case is Compass, an algorithm developed by a US company, Northpoint, which calculates the likelihood of someone reoffending and suggests what kind of supervision an offender should receive in prison. A young black man, Eric Loomis, received an 8-year and 6-month sentence for driving stolen car and fleeing police. The judge had concluded that Mr. Loomis was a high risk to the community based on this Compass score. But Compass wouldn't reveal the basis of the score because of commercial secrecy. The Wisconsin Supreme Court backed Compass. An article which included the Eric Loomis case by investigative journalism newsroom ProPublica revealed that black defendants were far more likely than white defendants to be incorrectly judged to be at a higher rate of recidivism. And as far as I know, the state of Wisconsin has yet to complete a statistical validation study of the Compass tool. What if your data set uses data based on discriminatory factors or proxies for those? Could it happen here? Well, there's nothing to stop it at present. Although we've looked at 2 reported instances at ACC and MB, and we've found that in fact those systems were not operating as feared or reported. We're very pleased that ministers took this issue seriously and recognised that this might be something Parliament should look at regulating. Our next speakers are going to talk about how the Ministry of Social Development is responding to the current gap in this space. I'm very encouraged that it has prioritised a piece of work called its Privacy, Human Rights and Ethics Framework to govern its operational use of predictive modelling and other data use. That's a laudable attempt to fill a lacuna in the law, but is it enough? We wouldn't be the first to regulate to enforce a precautionary approach. Other speakers are going to talk about the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, which takes effect on the 24th of May. It addresses automated decision-making and artificial intelligence and gives individuals the right to human intervention in cases of adverse decisions. Article 22(1) of the GDPR says, "The data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal effects concerning him or her or similarly significantly affects him or her." Article 22(3). The data controller shall implement suitable measures to safeguard the data subject's rights and freedoms and legitimate interests, at least the right to obtain human intervention on the part of the controller to express his or her point of view and to contest the decision. These protections are significant in the context of international benchmark setting. They are an influential signpost to future regulatory settings on automated decision-making for greater transparency. I'm going to draw them to Parliament's attention when we make our submission on the Privacy Bill and suggest that they might make a useful addition to our regulatory framework here, now that we have that rare opportunity. In the meantime, we're working with Statistics New Zealand on producing guidance to avoid some of the traps reported elsewhere, the sorts of things highlighted in Cathy O'Neill and others' book. They are still under development, but our working principles say data projects should only proceed where they delivered clear public benefit to New Zealanders. Fair enough. Surely that's a no-brainer. These are public assets, these data sets. They should be fit for purpose. They should focus on people, retain human oversight. We think transparency is essential, and we think researchers and people who operationalise these systems should understand their limitations. I want to close by going back to Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction. She reports the suggestion that data scientists, like doctors, should pledge an equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath, one that focuses on the possible misuses and misinterpretations of their data models. 2 financial engineers, Emmanuel Derman and Paul Wilmot, drew up one such oath in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. As an antidote to hubris, it begins, "I will remember that I didn't make the world and it doesn't satisfy my equations." And it concludes, "I understand that my work may have enormous effects on society and the economy, many of them beyond my comprehension. Now, I'll draw my comments to a close. I hope you have a fantastic day full of privacy. I hope you'll contribute to the discussion, particularly in the workshops. We need your input to inform how the law reform will work. We have the opportunity to go to a question time.
What about accountability? Because so often we hear about people challenging the information that is being used about them, but the organisations or people controlling that information say, well, that's the data we've got, and they become intransigent on that basis.
That is a long-standing principle that's part of the Privacy Act. It will be continued into the new bill. There is an ability for people to correct their information. I stood on this stage 3 years ago, I think, and reported a case that we had decided on in which an agency intransigently refused to acknowledge it had got a refugee's date of birth wrong. They said, "You can't change a date of birth." And they said, well, you know, it's wrong. We didn't have good papers when we arrived. Here's the paediatrician's report. Here's the bone density scan. It shows I am not 15, I am 18. And they ultimately did change. This is our bread and butter. Agencies have an obligation to review their data when asked by an individual and to correct it if it's wrong. And if it's a matter of opinion, they are obliged to attach a statement of correction to that data so that the disputed version is always seen with the corrected version. And where that's not done, people can complain to us and we will enforce it.